Firebrand Cooperative. So my work with Firebrand Cooperative is about change management for organizations, and that can be nonprofits, cooperatives, and for-profits, but anyone who's really trying to do great work out in the world, we want to be there to support them. And today, what we'll be doing is talking specifically about power and equity. You'll see slides. This is a webinar format, so you'll see slides. And you will also see, from time to time, we will stop, and I will be having some times for Q&A. And what you'll do is, if you're not familiar with this format, you will be, if you can click on the Q&A button on Zoom, on the chat, on Zoom, you'll see Q&A, and I'll take questions that way. So I'll be stopping periodically. I won't be speaking straight through for an hour and a half. But what you'll see is a time, it'll be very obvious when I'll take some Q&A, and I'd love to answer any of the questions that come up for you. We'll do as many as we can. And then I'll continue on doing the slides. So here we go. Oh, there we go. So I wanted to start first with key definitions, or I should say the learning objectives. First would be key definitions. So when we're having this conversation, that it would be helpful to you to be able to see where are we going? And the definitions are key in order to have this conversation, right? So we know that we're talking about the same things. So I'll go through some of those definitions to start. And then what we'll do is move on to different ways that we'll see kind of white dominant culture that kind of live and can be sometimes enacted in our, in the culture of our organizations and in the world. And then periodically, I'm also gonna point out tools and resources that leaders can use when they're thinking about using an equity framework in terms of their organizing, their meetings, how they're interacting with people and such. Sorry. Just a word about this space, even though it's a Q&A, where you'd be typing in your questions, this is still a learning space. And one way that I think about learning space is that we would be thinking about how the brave space is kind of a version of a safe space, but it's not quite that. It does require that there's some risks that happen in this space that are just a normal part of learning. So that we recognize that even in this virtual space where we've come together to learn together, that there's power dynamics that always count, that we call into accountability. It also requires us to just listen with an open mind. If you share some stories or things that you want to think about, that you're sharing stories, but you're also taking a role in listening, that there is a difference between impact and intent. So sometimes when I'm conveying something or you're conveying something, that there might be, you intended to say a certain thing, but the way it lands with people, sometimes it's not what we intend. And to just recognize that, to say, I understand the impact on you, what can I do? I'm hearing that, and I apologize for that. How could I do that differently? And then also, certainly no devil's advocates. So that means if you want to share something, we would just say, share it from your point of view, but as opposed to saying, I don't believe this, but what if someone were to say X thing? As people say, there are certainly enough devil's advocates in the world. So we don't need any more, and we won't do that in this space. Okay. We're going to start off with some definitions. And that word diversity, we hear it all the time. Really simply put, it is the range of human differences. And that means it's not limited to, but it does include race, ethnicity, gender identity, etc., political beliefs, all the range of human differences. Now, the thing about diversity is that sometimes this word is used in ways that mean lots of different things. Sometimes people say diversity, and what they mean is something really specific, one of these many listed things here. So they'll say, hey, we really want some diversity here, and what they're talking about is race. Or we really want some diversity, and they're talking about social class. And if that's the case, then what I would encourage is that we actually use that human difference specifically. Otherwise, conversations sometimes can get a little bit muddied, right? I've worked at companies that have talked about diversity hires, and I had no idea what they were talking about. It's certainly not language I would typically use, but it does kind of get a little bit confusing in conversations when people mean something specific and they're using diversity as a catch-all for everything, and they don't specifically mean it. If you mean it this way, that's good. Racism, a system of advantage or oppression based on race. So this is another one of these words that people use all the time in all kind of different ways. So-and-so is racist. That's racist. The way that I use it, and a lot of people in kind of more social movements will use that word, is really talking about systemic ways in which advantage and oppression is based on race in this country. It is different than racial prejudice or hatred or discrimination. So anyone can obviously have racial prejudice. Anyone can have hatred for another. Anyone can have discrimination. What we're talking about here is racism as a system. All right, a system that involves one group having power to carry out systematic discrimination through institutional policies, practices, the way shaping cultural beliefs and values that support these racist systems actually kind of come into policies and practices. And you will see as we continue why it is that I'll kind of continue to speak about systemic ways in which racism kind of plays into our lives. And the trap in some ways, when we start thinking about racism as an individual, as a one individual person who has prejudice or hatred. Power. So power over is the kind of definition that a lot of people use when they think power. You know, it's that ability to dominate, control people or things. And that's one definition of power. It's one that we're really familiar with. But there are different kinds of power. There's power with, which is the shared power that grows out of collaboration and relationships. So in and of itself, I, for one, think power is fantastic, right? Power over, not so much, but the power of collaborations, relationships, well, that's the whole thing about co-ops. So what makes us special? It makes us strong. It improves our communities when it's built on respect, mutual support, shared power, etc. And I did want to also add this. because I do think it's important as leaders to also think about power within, which is related to a person's sense of worth and self-knowledge. It includes an ability to recognize individual differences while respecting others. And so as a leader, the way in which we understand ourselves, the way that we know that we have self-worth, and we understand kind of the way we tick, certainly does help in the way that we can show up as a leader, and all the ways in which we can actually be influential in the best way possible, power with, as we're organizing, as we're leading a group. Bias. An inclination or prejudice for or against something or someone. So here's the thing, we always think like, all right, well, bias is when you think something bad of someone, but we have all sorts of different biases. And bias can be favorable towards something or someone for whatever reason, right? Like you have an inclination, it leans this way, it leans that way. You kind of are interested in that, or whatever it might be based on your experience, your understanding of the world. Explicit bias are the attitudes and beliefs you have on a conscious level. You're really, really clear what those attitudes and beliefs are. Like, I really feel, people of a certain class are the best ones for this position because of X thing you believe about them. Or again, negatively, if that's where your bias is. So you're conscious of it. Implicit bias, hidden bias, some people call it unconscious bias, are the attitudes and beliefs that we have that we're unaware of and we are all subject to. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about that, kind of a little bit about the brain works, but so those are the two differences in terms of explicit and implicit. So let's talk about implicit bias for a second, shall we? And I want to point this out as a tool. So one would say, how in the world would I be able to know what my implicit bias is if it's unconscious to me? That's the very nature of it, right? And there are different ways for sure. Some of it is introspection, et cetera, but the brain will do some funny things and hide these things for us. And this is one tool that I want to alert you to. So this is called the implicit association test. You may have heard about it. It's called the social attitudes test. It's free and anonymous. There might be 30 tests that are in it that have all sorts of common biases that people have. And the way it works is that when you have particular biases in your brain, you have automatic associations that you often may not know, right? X person of this physical ability, that's positive. Someone in a wheelchair, not. Now, one thing that I would say about that is, like, for most of us, that kind of idea is abhorrent to us. Like, oh my gosh, that's a terrible attitude to have. And so on a conscious level, on a value level, you would never think that. But in the background of our brains, we have some of these unwanted associations that we may not be aware of. And so bringing it out is a way, making it conscious, is a way to actually start to address them. And I'll talk about ways to kind of address biases that we have. But one of them is to actually first know that you have a particular bias. And this will be in all sorts of different topics. There's gender associations, there's sexual orientation associations, certainly race for sure. And so just to note as well that all of these things that you see in leadership tools and the books that I've also noted will be available for you in PDF in the in the Pathable platform. So you'll be able to find it. You don't have to scribble it down or anything like that. You'll be able to find all of these. Also, if you like to read, a good read for this will be called The Blind Spot. It's the hidden biases of good people, right? So it's like, we're trying to do good in the world, and it tells you much more about how these biases work. And they are the scientists who actually created the implicit association test. This implicit association test has been going on since the 90s. So there's huge data set now that really kind of gets a clear vision of the kind of overall kind of biases that we have as many people in this country. So it is, I can't encourage it enough. And sometimes the results are a little surprising, but again, it's to bring it up so we can actually do something about it. I'm going to take a moment for Q&A before I know that I kind of did a whole bunch of different things here. And so I'm going to actually stop the share for a second and see if I can find the Q&A. If there's any questions. Okay. I'm going to go back and share my screen. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and move on. Okay. So one thing I should have said probably before I dove in, but now that I think about it, is that there's many people in this room right now. And I don't know where you are in terms of your own particular journey of awakening in terms of dominant culture, bias, all the kind of hard conversations and kind of hard introspection that we need to do in order to bring some of these things to light, to have a good understanding of the country that we are, what we've been, the country we are now, and where we're going. This is not necessarily the conversation you would have per se if this is the first time you've ever really started thinking about it, you haven't read any books, you haven't been doing any kind of introspection. So even though I shared those definitions, the conversation is assuming that you have a certain sort of understanding. All right. So that's where I'm kind of heading with some of the conversations. So I wouldn't say this is a 101 webinar, but it's not. But even if this is the first time you're kind of sitting and you're thinking about these things, you're struggling with it, you're in the throes of kind of awakening and understanding, you're welcome here. But the conversation will probably be at a different place than what I would start with a 101 discussion. So just a couple more definitions before we get into white dominant culture. And I think what makes sense is to actually define culture. It's the knowledge, experience, beliefs, etc., that a group of people over time, through generations, develop. So this is everything that we kind of, in some ways, understand about the world, right? Even the notion of time can be very, very different with one culture or another. We just think, of course, culture is kind of the air we breathe. So we think like this is just the way it is, but we transport ourselves to some other place entirely. And all of these things can be very, very different. So it's something that's kind of around us, but we just kind of don't know it's there because it's just the way things are. In terms of white dominant culture, these are the norms and standards that, actually this is a little different, but okay. These are the norms and standards that are based on primarily the ideas and notions and fears, frankly, of white, of European descended people. The thing about it is that what we see as kind of norms and standards, they're often not chosen. And so it's not actually being often proactively named or chosen by a group. This happens a lot. So what ends up happening is this. You go into a group and they would say something like, well, this is just the way we do the work. This is the way it always is. And sometimes people are actually pretty unhappy about the way it is, but no one's ever really stopped to kind of think about, like, why is it that we're doing the things that we're doing in the way that we're doing them? All right. So the thing is that this affects everybody. And it is a way in which any group can actually come together and be working in kind of a white dominant culture kind of framework without even knowing it, right? Because we're all in this place, in this time in history, learning what we learn, doing what we do, and it is just the way it is. And then you find that without actually stopping, observing, understanding, and then saying, hey, might be some things that you choose that are exactly the way that you want to be working. And then actually realizing that, or perhaps it's an opportunity to discuss and to learn and decide for another way forward if that is the way that's correct for your group. Now, what I say about this is also any group at all can be in a white dominant culture framework. So you can have folks of color that are also in that framework. You can have, it doesn't, in some ways doesn't matter because we're all kind of affected in such a way. But again, understanding norms and standards and then proactively naming them, discussing and choosing as a group is a really effective way to actually really start thinking about, like, oh, it's not really quite the air we're breathing. we can kind of be aware and choose to do things differently if we like to. So this is another leadership tool that I wanted to point out. It's something that I certainly have used with groups, and it can be used in lots of different ways. This is a link to it, but ultimately, again, you will have you'll have all the links so you can actually get to it. I'm just going to click on here to see if I can actually bring it up real quick for you. And it looks something like this. It's about 5 pages. And there's lots and lots of different things here. So this is definitely not one that I would be going through every single one with you. But we are going to actually take a minute to actually talk about some of these things. And one thing that was really fascinating, the way that one group used it, and they kind of did this on their own, was they decided that before every staff meeting, they were actually going to pick out one of these aspects and talk about it, their understanding of it, and also to kind of see, like, is this something that I individually might be kind of working under this particular dominant culture trait? Does our group work this way? And if so, is there something else that we would choose to do? So I'll give you a kind of sense of what that is. So one of these aspects is defensiveness. Know where to air grievances. The focus is on protecting power. And again, this is really more about power over, instead of addressing harms, naming intention without acknowledging impact. So I've been talking in the very beginning, kind of had some of these words because I knew, you know, it kind of leaves the groundwork to what we're talking about now. So I'll give you an instance of how this can play out as a leader. You're a small group, you've been organizing for some time. Everyone is sort of like-minded, and so things are just kind of going the way they're going. You don't necessarily name group norms because everyone knows kind of how it goes, but you decide that you're gonna, you want more diverse voices. So you invite them in some ways into folks with different understandings of the world to come in, to broaden your understanding of your community, the way that you might organize, et cetera. But then as people might participate and bring some things to, you know, kind of bring things up, the reaction is, wait, what? No, you just don't understand. We've done it this way, or you don't understand. This is not how we really are. There's been some situations where people have taken some real offense to maybe their co-op organizing being seen as a gentrifying type of thing, or a group of people who are not connected to, say, the Black community or Latinx community. So they're being brought in, and then all of a sudden they're saying, well, no, we absolutely are for everyone, but the person saying, hey, these are the ways in which the way you're organizing and the way you're saying things is actually kind of dismissive of these particular parts of the community, right? So it's like you're trying to say something or trying to air grievances. Either there's no real process for that, or that instead of actually talking about, you know, what the harms could be, there's something else that happens, which is usually kind of like a block. And a lot of times being this intention and impact piece where people say, you know, our intention is this thing. Well, we were trying to do good work. And so then the impact is kind of pushed aside, right? There's maybe harm that's being done in some communities, but it's what's really brought up and kept, you know, kind of shuts down the conversation is the insistence that the intention is good. So therefore the impact doesn't matter. Let's knock that down. Instead, vulnerability. So giving and receiving feedback non-defensively. Having a clear structure to hear and address grievances. Like, so what does it mean when we don't agree? And so everybody knows there's a process, maybe on your agenda, you're really, really clear, like, this is the time for actual real conversation. We're gonna come out, and the way we would come to an agreement is X thing. I've worked with some groups who were really unclear how they made decisions. And that's actually incredibly difficult, particularly when you're looking at white dominant culture. The default for that, when there is no clear structure, is that it goes ultimately to the dominant kind of what's in place in terms of the dominant culture. So you might all talk about it, and then in the end, it doesn't matter because it's maybe one strong person who makes a decision, or that it's like, well, thanks for your input, but you know, we really aren't going to act on a certain thing. Now, I am all for democracy. I think it's really important, but I'm all for a democracy that is really clear in structure. So if you're new to organizing, you haven't been around, or maybe you've been organizing for some time, but some of your governance pieces aren't together, I would say this is a way in which you really would want to start kind of thinking about getting really clear, so that your leadership and your organizing is in such a way that is gives structure so people know how to actually interact, that they're not feeling blindsided because they were asked to give some information and then they're just told, well, no, sorry, we're not going to act on that. If you kind of know ahead of time, then that's good, healthy conversation to have. And then saying, okay, well, then we're going to make a decision based on this clear structure, right? So that feedback and kind of the clear structure, hearing grievances, how to do so is super important. And then also this vulnerability piece in terms of skills that are being supported for being both self-critical and self-loving. And I'm gonna really kind of hone in on this thing for us leaders. That balance between being self-critical and self-loving is really important. And a lot of business, you know, if I'm talking to business people, whatever it is, in some of these for-profit companies, you know, self-loving doesn't come up in conversation, and they don't really feel like it has a part to it. And I actually think it absolutely does. Because I think there's a way in which we're taking in information that's difficult and we're in a vulnerable place, that we are both, yes, that we are able to actually think about ourselves and think about what we want to be doing, and really think about whether or not we're showing up in the world that we wish to, in the way that we wish to all the time. And then being kind to ourselves also when sometimes you might come up short, because it does give the kind of freedom, that flexibility to say like, okay, well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to learn. I'm going to do this differently next time. But that is a vulnerable place. But vulnerability without actually self-loving in some ways is pretty masochistic. So I'm going to say it's important, and certainly something that I would invite you to kind of really think about and be kind to yourself. Transactional relationships. So, detached professional communication for the purpose of completing transaction and efficiency. So I, for one, think, you know, I like efficiency. Efficiency is important, it's good. I was project manager. You know, I do think it's, you know, with the time that you have, that you use it wisely, and, you know, and efficiency is fine, but certainly not at the risk of having relationships that are just transactional. So if you're reaching out to people, acknowledge them only when you need something from them. And this is going to be another one of these things you're like, well, what good person does that? That's terrible, right? You might judge it. But it is something that is certainly part of, it is actually in some ways often celebrated in this particular country, right? It's just like, hey, it's professional. This is efficient. We're able to do more things. You just reach out to that person and you have that relationship that is about needing something. What I have found in conversations with many food co-op leaders that are actually growing and making headway in terms of their organizing, building up boards, building their ownership, is that this is a long-term thing. So let's get away from that, or crinkle it up, throw that away. And what they're really interested in is building relationships internally and externally that are based on trust, understanding, and shared commitments. So sometimes this is not celebrated in this country so much. And so it's one of those things where sometimes it feels for some that, well, I don't have enough time. It's a waste of time. We can only do so much, but what we really need, we're trying to build this code. We're trying to do this thing. We're trying to get a grant. We're, you know, that type of thing. But it is, in the end, the relationships that you invest, that you really treasure, that you cultivate, that is the lasting connections that actually build your co-op. It seems so simple, but if you really, when you get into time constraints, You get into capacity issues as maybe a small organizing steering committee or board. Or even as you get bigger, right? You're maybe getting closer to where you're going to do a capital campaign. You're in the middle of capital campaign. Things actually just get faster. And so this kind of idea of like, well, we don't have the time, that pressure of not having time. Well, that's a real thing, that feeling that, but to slow the brakes on that, to say, no, when things get really rough, it's about these transformational relationships that are going to take you through, right? That is really in the end, when things kind of go sideways, your internal relationship that you built as a leader in the community and also on your board, or in a committee, maybe you're a community leader, those internal relationships and then externally, those are the things that are actually going to underpin almost everything that you end up doing, both as a startup and generally when the store's built, right? So I can't encourage you enough. I sometimes also, just in my thing, I'm just thinking like, did I take a time, even if it's just for a second, to really slow down and say like, hey, how are you? It's particularly in these times with COVID and all the political uprisings, and people are suffering, and while your organizing is still continuing under these things, the humanity first, right? The ability to see, greet, and acknowledge someone and say like, are you fine? And sometimes you don't need anything, right? Like one way would be to test this is like you give someone a call, and if they're just already bracing themselves, because you usually call when you're just asking for something, you'd be surprised by just the breath sometimes, or the surprise and the delight when someone is like, oh, you're just calling to see I came to mind and you just checked in on me. So do it as a practice. It is not only, I think, enriching, but ultimately, again, like I said, it's actually good business. So it's not doing it because I know I'm going to need them later. It's just inevitable that you will have a relationship that you're going to need each other. And so take that time as a leader. There's another aspect as well of white dominant culture is changing the subject away from race. All right, so this limited understanding of how biases work, biases and culture interplay with all the aspects of our lives and systems. And we see differences as bad. And the perception that talking about biases is actually an attack on white people, or that white people cannot handle the conversation. This is, boy, there's so much to say here. What I would say is this, that the idea of, maybe for some of you, you have heard, or maybe have said yourself, I don't see color. And I actually understand many of the reasons why folks might actually say that. But one concern here is that what underpins the I don't see color is that the assumption is that seeing color is somehow bad. Seeing someone, say, even in a wheelchair, that's bad. Whereas like, that is not, it's just as it is, right? The stories we tell, perhaps some of the hidden biases that we have about differences, well, that's a whole other thing. But actually seeing it and being able to kind of build the knowledge base, the reservoir, the learning community, that you can actually talk about these things, sometimes difficult conversations, but differences aren't bad. these things exist, they're actually interplaying in aspects of our lives. So shatter that and instead have a compassionate curiosity about how race and cultural differences might be at play. With a 360-degree compassion, all right? So it's like we're all kind of I think in many ways, all of us are suffering one way or another. All of us are in some sort of trauma due to the systematic racism that is in this country. And so let's assume that there are some unconscious biases that are often at work in many of our situations. And we create an environment that celebrates this courage to be able to explore racial bias in all its forms. And I would say this is this gotcha, the good / bad person camp, right? I kind of call it a little bit like this, what people call, play like wacko racist, like that person's racist and that person's racist. Like I said, I don't really use that language, but still that person's a racist. And we just get that person out. If we find that person, then we get them out, or if we educate that person and then they become a better person, then it's all going to be better. And I don't know about you, but I've definitely been reading a lot in these papers about different Fortune 500 companies and all sorts of different places where this has happened, right? There's been like, let's get this person. And I'm not saying, quite frankly, in a lot of cases, I absolutely should be ousted. But then you find that somehow the company culture is still the same. Well, how could that be, right? If everything was about this bad person doing these bad things, why doesn't the culture change? Why is it that what we see in terms of leadership in almost every sector in this country is mostly white leaders and with brown and black workforces, that type of thing. So like, how could it be that that one person, when what you're seeing kind of on a pattern basis is systematic, which is why in the beginning of the definitions, I made a point to talk about systemic ways in which racial bias plays out. Because then that takes away that whole, like, what your primary idea is to just weed out racist people, right? And it moves the conversation to what are the ways, all the ways, these patterns, these aspects of dominant culture, these systems and these policies that kind of undergird this. And why, as much as we keep doing trainings and talking and that type of thing, really, in terms of outcomes, it's been so slow to shift. There is a fundamental deep dive understanding of systems and all the ways that we kind of show up as individuals and all the ways that we show up as organizations that really need to be pulled apart. And it's hard work and it's long work, but it's definitely work that is, I say, worth the time, worth the effort, if we actually want to walk in this world the way that that line up with our values and our vision. Either or thinking. Believing people are racist or non-racist, this is what I was talking about before. And also seeing incidents of being isolated events. So you may actually even be in a co-op or in a community where there was something that happened that was incredibly galvanizing, right? And everyone's attention just went to this, like, and then you might even see in social media, or maybe you've said to yourself, well, wait a minute, we're good people in this community. We are, this is not who we are. And again, if you're thinking in terms of systems, then it's not racist or non-racist. It's not even good or bad, right? Instead, we'll blow that away and we'll talk about systems and complexity thinking. The understanding of context and intersectionality, and I'll go back to intersectionality in a second. Seeing patterns and holding contradictory thoughts and feelings simultaneously. So this is so important for us as work as leaders to understand that there's many ways in which we have these values. Sometimes it doesn't match up with the way that we're behaving. Sometimes it doesn't match up in the way that we might show up in space. And then all the things that I was talking about in terms of self-knowledge, right? The self, to understand yourself, self-love, kind of be like, boy, you know, that's not what that's not how I want to show up. I'm gonna have to have a hard conversation with someone, or I need to sit down and like really think about this. That doesn't then make you a bad person, it makes you human. And then understanding context and intersectionality. So language around intersectionality has been used in lots of different ways. And sometimes in terms of white privilege. One thing that I would say is that all of us are kind of showing up in the world in many, many different ways. You might be Black and middle class. Someone might be white and they might be rich, and they might be gay. They might be, all of these things that are kind of coming together, and you know, you're entering in the world as a very complex human being with complex thoughts as well. It is a function of the history of this country and the way in which we have prioritized the needs, particularly of certain parts of the country, white, middle class, male, able-bodied, cisgendered, et cetera, as standard, that parts of, if you're differing from any of those particular standards and norms, that difference definitely, as Donna Brenman would say, that difference makes a difference. Okay, so I may be less affected by one part of my kind of being in this world, say I'm able-bodied, but certainly walking around with this gender, with my skin color, there's ways in which that's affecting me. And there's all these ways in which I have to kind of move around in the world with all of the complexity of my whole self. Okay, so in 101 training, what I normally do is not even get into this, because there's some sort of like, okay, let's have a basic understanding of this work. And you kind of want to encourage people to keep doing the work. If they kind of sometimes know really how complex it can be, it's sort of like, it's overwhelming and I don't know where to start. So sometimes don't start. But since this isn't 101, you know, this is real talk. We're going to talk about like the fact that it's not all easy and it's not all clean, but this is the work, this is the real work. And that doing this in community is certainly a way in which like we can continue to hold each other accountable, continue to care about each other and love each other, and start moving some of these things in our own behaviors as leaders, in the way that we organize in our co-ops, the way that we actually move around in our communities, right? To kind of really think differently about what we're doing and what your intent is and what your impact is, and hopefully kind of like start getting those things to be kind of more or less the same. Fear of open conflict. Okay. Right to comfort. Politeness is valued over honesty, and white fragility goes unchecked. Those who bring up the discomfort are the ones that all of a sudden people will actually scapegoat, and all the energy goes towards like, why did you do that? Why did you say that? You made that person uncomfortable. I think the best way to just even describe what's happened to me is in times if I've brought something up and someone started crying. I actually didn't, I said what was true. I didn't attack anyone. I didn't yell at them, but it was so uncomfortable. They were so upset. And then it was like, well, Darnell's the angry Black woman who made this person cry. And it was like, oh no, like so the impact certainly, that I would own. But as we really kind of took that whole thing apart, it was, there was this idea, an unwritten rule, as a matter of fact, in this particular organization, that polite was the most important value. I didn't know. I mean, I thought I was being polite, but what they thought polite was to not say the hard thing, not have the hard discussion. That was as bad as if I had cursed this person out, which of course I didn't do. But it was taken that way. There's a great offense to, like, how could you have upset this person? And this idea of kind of the right to comfort, meaning who in the group does the group, because this often happens, a group will organize around who needs to be comfortable. As a leader, maybe we have some board chairs here, maybe we have, don't know, maybe you're someone just in a community where people will be like, make sure that the focus is actually making sure that you're comfortable. That's a hard thing to kind of sometimes know, right? But that there's a way in which people orient and say, upsetting this person, making them angry, doing whatever, making them uncomfortable, getting the, if they're going to act defensive or they're going to do this. So we cannot do this way. We have to make sure that everything, the system, your internal system, is about this group, this person, maybe the white people in your community, feel comfortable. First and foremost. This could happen as you're looking for, maybe you're looking, to think about what organizations in your community that you actually want to be doing some work with, or what your funders might be. And then the question is, well, can we say this thing? Can we do this messaging? Can we support X thing if it makes this group uncomfortable, right? The white dominant group uncomfortable. And then there's the second part of this, which is useful feedback not given in a timely manner, resulting in underperformance. All right, so this kind of can come up in lots and lots of different ways, but it's the right to comfort kind of that drives this, like, over politeness. I'll call it over politeness. That is actually in some ways dishonest and not truthful. So there's no feedback loop. There's no way to actually talk about, well, what are we doing well? What is happening that is that we can do better, right? This isn't my language. This is coming from the workbook, but I would say, like, yeah, what are we doing better? What can we do better with? How do we grow, right? And so this dishonesty that creates problems that are left unintended, they become bigger and bigger down the road. It just gets kicked down the road, right? So it's like you knew this was a problem, X amount of years ago when you're organizing. Now you're at the point in which you're doing a capital campaign, and it's the same problem, but now it's a way bigger problem because you need now millions of dollars, and you still have not built up the culture that you've chosen, hopefully as a group, to actually say, no, we're not going to do it this way. Like, we're going to be able to call each other in and say, hey, here's some feedback. Here are some things that we need to do better. Here are some things that we can, like, maybe you need more support around this. Maybe we need to get some more information to be able to do things that are going to move the organizing along. So this was built for a nonprofit. So some of the language, again, this is not my own worksheet, and you'll see it's attributed to the folks on the bottom of the slide. But instead, what you want is to, you're getting timely supportive feedback, right? That's culturally and individually in responsive ways. Now, I'm gonna break this down a little bit and say, this is a workshop specifically targeted towards leaders. However you show up in the world, and just because you're not a board chair doesn't mean you're not a leader, right? If you're on the board, you're certainly a leader, and you can be a leader even if you're not on a board, but you're a leader in your own community, right? So there's lots of ways that we kind of show up, whether it's formal or informal, as leaders. But so you might say, like, oh my gosh, well, there's all these people. How am I supposed to give supportive feedback in culturally and individual responsive ways for all these people, right? As you have a group, you have a team, you have a board, whatever it might be. If you were, say, a board chair or if you're a committee member, part of kind of even onboarding someone is to get to know them. And you might say, hey, what is the best way? How do you like to receive feedback? What is helpful to you? What makes you feel supported? And to know that, and to be able to give it, both in positive and not negative, positive and kind of ways that might be a little tougher. But to build that kind of like, okay, like this is the way that this person has said they wanted to have feedback. This is the way that I can give it. This works for them. It's an individually responsive way. All right. Some people like emails to sit and think about it. Sometimes it's overwhelming if you're talking at them. Sometimes English might not be the first language. So like, what is the best way? Maybe, maybe it is written so that you can have more time to kind of take it in. Or maybe there's more kind of checking in on a regular basis. There's all sorts of different ways, but to be really kind of thoughtful. This is not only does it help in terms of building expectation and understanding, but it also grows folks' ability to do the work. And that there is a timely way in which like there's this feedback loop, right? So I think there's lots of different ways to do this, but certainly just simply by asking. And I would also say this, please do think about how you prefer to have feedback given to you. Because you might find yourself in a situation where if you're able to actually convey how you would like feedback given to you, people will try to often try to accommodate. And that for all of us who, I think a natural reaction sometimes can be defensive, one of the things that I had talked about in terms of aspects of dominant culture, getting the feedback in such a way that you were like, oh, this is the way that I said that I wanted it. I'm going to be able to sit with it in this way. This is helpful to me, is a good thing to know, right? Because you could say like, well, boy, that was really tough, what I'm hearing. And I do want the feedback. If you could, give me a call, or just send me, however thing you kind of wanted, it kind of improves our ability to understand our what works for us as leaders, right? And we want to make sure that we have feedback given to us that's actually helping us to kind of continue to grow, but we also want to be able to give feedback to others as well, right? So know thyself as a leader. Your group will appreciate it, I would imagine, in many, many different ways. Vulnerability, feedback, and leadership. So these are some resources that could be helpful to you. Again, there is a PDF with all the resources and links and such, so you don't have to write this down. I am a big Brene Brown fan. Her work and her research about vulnerability really has changed the way that I lead and also the way that I coach leaders. Really insightful. So brave, brave work, tough conversations, and whole hearts. I think I've just kind of touched on all of those things, how hard the work is. We're talking about brave space all the time. Tough conversations, certainly with, and feedback. And then, you know, you're working out of a space of vulnerability. And so that's coming at it kind of like certainly in a heart space. There's a podcast called Dare to Lead, and that I listen to often. If you're a podcast person as opposed to a book person, that might be one of those things that, you know, you can kind of listen to. And that is lots of interviews with leaders across sectors. And they kind of talk about, you know, how they kind of think about leadership and how they kind of move in the world. And then the book called Thanks for the Feedback, The Science and Art of Receiving Feedback Well. And so I want to just kind of reiterate, there's a science and art, and I would say even a practice of feedback. If you have this understanding like, well, I'm a good person, I'm an open-minded person, and therefore I should be able to take feedback well, that's maybe possible, probable, sure. But I think it is a practice. So that book actually is helpful in kind of understanding why it is that some feedback is kind of lands in a way that's helpful and sometimes it does not, and how to give it and how to receive it and all of that other stuff. It's a great book. They also wrote a book called Difficult Conversations, which some of you may be familiar with. Although I didn't go through a slide about this specifically, I do think for those of you, again, that are newer to some of these ideas or just, you know, are looking for more information to learn. So You Want to Talk About Race is a fantastic book. It's written in a way that's so engaging and accessible. It's a biracial woman author who's just fantastic and yes, very relatable. And so it's all these questions that maybe, you know, you have kind of knocking around in your head that you know, she's very upfront, and I think it's really approachable. As a woman of color, I read the book and I had a lot of things to take away from it as well. So I thought it was written for everybody. Just great book and not too long. And I'll give this some of you might be participating in the Abolitionist Challenge with LaDonna Redmond. And if you are, then you would have read this book. If you've not heard of it, it's called My Grandmother's Hands, and it's about racialized trauma and the pathway to mending our hearts and bodies. This is, and I think Resmaa Menakem is a psychiatrist, I think so. This book is not an easy read in terms of the content. No, you can read it, I mean, it's well written, but it's hard work. It wouldn't have been the first place that I would start if I was early in this journey. But if you're kind of looking for a level of kind of healing, deep healing, understanding and healing, it can be a rough book, but a transformational book. And so I did want to put that out as a resource if that's something that you're interested in, kind of ready to undertake. Okay. And talk a little bit about also the ladder of inference. So, and actually I should have had another place for a Q&A. So I'm actually going to take a second to stop before I get into the next thing and see if there's any Q&A questions that have come in. Let's see if I can find it here. And let's see. Yeah. think I should be able to see it through Pathable, but as you can see, I do not see that. So if you have any questions, if you can put it in chat, that would be fantastic. Okay. All righty. I'm gonna go ahead and share screen. And there'll be some time as well at the end for any Q&A. And if you are actually trying to write something and I am not seeing it, I apologize. Pathable works a little different than Zoom itself. And so it's not, there's kind of different platforms that I'm kind of working through. So I apologize for that. But hopefully we'll be able to interact if you are writing questions. Okay, so I want to talk a second about this particular leadership tool. I think that there's one aspect to the way that our brain works that is really, really helpful to know if you are a leader and you're specifically trying to lead in such a way that with power and equity kind of in mind, right? So there's an article, you'll see that, and I want to actually show you a video in a second as well. But so knowing that the brain actually works in such a specific way, it's a tool that's used all the time, and I'll kind of show you the next slide and what that is. Ladder of inference. Okay, so some of you may have heard of this. This might be new to others. This is used in all sorts of different ways. I use it when I talk about it, when I'm doing implicit bias training. It takes into a lot of ways the way the brain works. And I'll show you a video in a second, so you'll get to see it. But it's a way that you can actually start to really think about how your organization works, how you as a leader work, and then really start slowing down the way that you make decisions. What I would say is if you're not mindful of how you're making decisions, often you're falling into the traps of white dominant culture that you may not have decided or selected, right? It's just like all of a sudden, you're up the ladder. So I'll talk a little bit about it and then I'll show you a video. So I experience and observe data as a video, right? So you're taking in all the information that you can. Boy, I meant to write down this data point, but ultimately I think your brain can kind of take in about 1 million different things at one time, literally. Like, well, it can observe all this stuff, but actually it filters it down to like 40 data points. All right, so kind of like imagine the brain kind of observing a thing, but on that second thing, it literally sits through all this information. And you select the data that you feel is relevant and you discard data that you think is irrelevant. You don't even know what you're doing this. This is, milliseconds, right? So all this information filters, you're selecting this data and you're like, yep, I see this, I see this, I see this, I see this. That is often also based on like our experiences in the world. What we actually notice, what we see, whatever it is all based on like all these experiences that we have, but it's so seamless, we don't even know. So why you can actually, maybe you're sitting down next to someone, you're seeing the same thing and literally you're taking in all this different data. You're like, you saw what? So you select data. And then also based on experiences, how you're understanding the world, culture, you add a meaning based on what I feel is reasonable according to the data I selected, right? So you don't know all of this happened. So when you have all this information, it's filtered, you select data, and then you add meaning to the data that you're seeing. you make an assumption that the data in the meeting is accurate and represent reality, right? So you think what you kind of, the story that you've made about the data, what you've seen is accurate and represents reality, when sometimes maybe not. You draw conclusions based on assumptions. You adopt beliefs based on those conclusions, and then you act. This happens so fast, you don't even know it's happening. So I mentioned that I kind of teach for implicit bias. It's used in lots of business schools in terms of trying to slow down the ladder of inference. So people are kind of building in different systems to try to question at every rung of the ladder. Like, wait a minute, like, let's question this, let's question this, let's do this. What are the ways in which we can make better observations, collect better data, have different meaning and assumptions, and draw conclusions and beliefs, and take perhaps different actions if we're actually looking at each rung in a different way. If you're building a diverse team, right, and I do mean this in the way I mean diversity of all sorts, or specifically, if you are a white organizing board, or even brown or black organizing board, but you realize that you've actually been running under a lot of these different, like, white dominant aspects, I would say this is even more crucial, that the way in which you kind of think about how you're putting together your team that is giving some more broad-based understanding of experiences and observations that can take in all sorts of different data, that and maybe not some things that some groups might think is irrelevant, or you might think is irrelevant. They're bringing in and saying, well, this is exactly why we actually, this piece of information is incredibly irrelevant, which could change the meaning that you've kind of come, and the assumptions that you make, the conclusions that you make, the adopted beliefs and actions. So I'm going to actually show you, it's a video, it's about 5 minutes. But this will kind of put it all together. It's in a cartoon form, so, but it reviews a lot of what I'm saying kind of in a story.
Imagine a microscopic-sized ladder contained in the part of our brain that will label our subconscious. The ladder of inference, which was first proposed by Harvard professor Chris Argyris, is the basis of this model. Every time we interact with someone, that experience enters the ladder at the bottom. That same experience zips up the ladder in the blink of an eye, exiting at the top. This process...
Oh, I'm not sure. I'm going to stop this just for a second. Sharing is pause, bring your window to the front. So I'm going to stop this for a second and make sure that you can see it. I'm sorry if that did not work.
Imagine a microscopic-sized ladder contained in the part of our brain that will label our subconscious. The ladder of inference, which was first proposed by Harvard professor Chris Argyris, is the basis of this model. Every time we interact with someone, that experience enters the ladder at the bottom. That same experience zips up the ladder in the blink of an eye, exiting at the top. This process happens thousands of times a day without us knowing it. Let's focus on what happens on each rung of the ladder. On the first rung, we have the raw data and observations of our experience. This is very similar to what someone watching a video recording of our experience would see. Moving up to the second rung, we filter in specific information and details from our experience. We unknowingly filter based on our preferences, tendencies, and many other aspects that we believe are important. On to the third rung. we assign meaning to the information we have filtered through. This is where we start to interpret what our information is telling us. On the fourth rung, a very crucial thing happens. We develop assumptions based on the meaning we created on the previous rung, and we start to blur the distinction between what is fact and what is story. On the fifth rung, we develop conclusions based on our assumptions. This is also where our emotional reactions are created. On the sixth rung, we adjust our beliefs about the world around us, including the person or people involved in our experience of the moment. On the seventh and final rung, we take action based on our adjusted beliefs. Still with me? Great. Let's take a real-life example and run it up the ladder to see how this all works. Have you ever been cut off in a parking lot, signal light on, as you steer toward your coveted spot only to slam on your brakes at the last minute as someone pulls in front of you and steals your spot away? Imagine that experience and notice all of the data and observations landing on the first rung of your ladder. Now let's watch what we pay attention to on the second rung. Who cares that it's sunny out and the birds are chirping? The 50% off sign outside of your favorite store is meaningless. You filter in the sensation of your grip tightening on the wheel, you feel your blood pressure rise, you hear the squeal of your brakes, and you notice the expression on the face of the other driver as he pulls in front of you and quickly looks away. Time for our third rung. Ever since you were young, your parents taught you the importance of waiting in line and taking your turn. You live and die by the rule of first come, first serve. And now this guy is just...
I'm going to pause this a second. I think I finally was able to see your Q&A. So thank you for that. And I think you're not seeing the video, if I am not mistaken. So I'm going to give it one more try. And if not, we'll just go to Q&A. I did kind of talk through this a little bit, but if for whatever reason I can't show it, you will see. Oh, we see some people are seeing it. Interesting. Some people are seeing it and some people are not. So you just see my camera. Sorry, folks. I'm going to do it one more time. Again, if it doesn't work, it's fine. You have the access to it. And I kind of talked through it a little bit, but I thought that would just give you a little bit of a kind of different take on this. But if it doesn't work, that's all right. And thank you for your patience. I appreciate that. Okay. So interesting. What is happening here? All right, one more try. And I would completely appreciate if you are able, if I can show it now and you see it, to let me know. And if you do not, I will turn it off right away so as not to take up any more of the time.
Imagine a microscopic-sized ladder contained in the part of our brain that will label our subconscious. The ladder of inference, which was first proposed by Harvard professor Chris, is the basis of this model. Every time we interact with someone, that experience enters the ladder at the bottom. That same experience zips up the ladder in the blink of an eye, exiting at the top. This process happens thousands of times a day without us knowing it. Let's focus on what happens on each rung of the ladder. On the first rung, we have the raw data and observations of our experience. This is very similar to what someone watching a video recording of our experience would see. Moving up to the second rung, we filter in specific information and details from our experience. We unknowingly filter based on our preferences, tendencies, and many other aspects that we believe are important. Onto the third rung, we assign meaning to the information we have filtered through. This is where we start to interpret what our information is telling us. On the fourth rung, a very crucial thing happens. We develop assumptions based on the meaning we created on the previous rung, and we start to blur the distinction between what is fact and what is story. On the fifth rung, we develop conclusions based on our assumptions. This is also where our emotional reactions are created. On the sixth rung, we adjust our beliefs about the world around us, including the person or people involved in our experience of the moment. On the seventh and final rung, we take action based on our adjusted beliefs. Still with me? Great. Let's take a real-life example and run it up the ladder to see how this all works. Have you ever been cut off in a parking lot, signal light on, as you steer toward your coveted spot only to slam on your brakes at the last minute as someone pulls in front of you and steals your spot away? Imagine that experience and notice all of the data and observations landing on the first rung of your ladder. Now let's watch what we pay attention to on the second rung. Who cares that it's sunny out and the birds are chirping? The 50% off sign outside of your favorite store is meaningless. You filter in the sensation of your grip tightening on the wheel, you feel your blood pressure rise, you hear the squeal of your brakes, and you notice the expression on the face of the other driver as he pulls in front of you and quickly looks away. Time for our third rung. Ever since you were young, your parents taught you the importance of waiting in line and taking your turn. You live and die by the rule of first come, first serve. And now this guy has just stolen your spot. What gives? Up to the fourth rung we go. Watch closely as our assumptions take over and our story creates itself. That stupid jerk. Didn't his parents teach him anything? How could he not see my signal light? He must never pay attention. Why does he think he's more important than anyone else? Jumping quickly to the fifth rung, we conclude that this guy is heartless, inconsiderate. He needs to be taught a lesson and put in his place. We feel angry, frustrated, vindictive, justified. On our sixth rung, we adjust our beliefs based on the experience. That's the last time I give in. Next time someone tries to cut me off, tires will be smoking on the pavement as I squeal past them into my spot. And finally, our last rung, we take action. We back up, pull up behind his car, honk our horn, and roll down our window to scream a few choice words his way. Now, imagine, he walks over quickly, apologizing. His wife, who is almost due with their first baby, called him from inside the mall to say she is in labor and needs to get to the hospital immediately. We are momentarily shocked, apologize profusely, and wish him luck as he rushes toward the entrance. What just happened here? What changed? Why is this so significant? In our parking lot example, our beliefs were short-circuited by the ladder of the other individual. My wife is in labor. I need to get there quick. There's a parking spot. Phew. Oh, geez, I cut someone off. I better apologize quickly so they don't think I'm a jerk. But what if we were able to short-circuit our ladders ourselves, proactively, by choice? Guess what? We can. Let's return to our unique human function of free will. Next time you notice yourself reacting to your experience, pay focused attention to your ladder. Ask yourself what beliefs are at play, and where did they come from? What data and observations did you filter in as a result of your beliefs, and why? Are your assumptions valid and supported by facts? Would a different set of assumptions create different feelings and result in new and better conclusions and actions? We all have our own unique ladder. Be mindful of yours and help others to see theirs.
All right. I am gonna go stop the share for a second. There we go. Boy, oh boy, that was some work. So I'm glad that we finally were able to find it. And actually, we have 5 minutes. My last slide basically just says who has questions. And now that I actually am able to see on my phone the Q&A, and I can also see it on Zoom. I have many ways in which I can answer anything or anything that you would want to share with the group. The final thing about that ladder of inference, I do want to say is that sometimes, like the video I think is really super helpful. The first time I came across the ladder of inference was maybe 10 years ago. I was reading another book. It was on Zen meditation, and it was actually about anger management. And I didn't realize they told a story. It was similar, a bit different, because there was a cow involved, but nonetheless. It was the ladder of inference. I didn't even realize it until I saw that video, and there was language around it. But so it's used in lots of different ways. And it's kind of like, this is one of those things like, well, the parking space is annoying. Okay, that happens. But there's some deadly consequences with some of these ladders. That a decision is made, something is taken in, it's really fast and it goes flying up someone's ladder. If it's someone who's in law enforcement or otherwise has some kind of like way in which that interaction can be violent, that there's these tragic circumstances that can happen with some of these ladders. As a leader, it might be that you are interacting with people in ways that you are unexpected. If you're doing an interview or you're trying to get people on board, you might be running up ladders and you don't even realize that you're doing it, right? So these are all, I mean, I've kind of given you a bunch of different tools. This is meant to be kind of a whole smattering of ideas and techniques and tools and resources that you might find useful as a leader, things that you can enact at any point to just take on a little bit of this thing and kind of just start learning and practicing, right? We're in a, consider us a learning, kind of practicing group together. We're trying to be the best possible leaders as possible, that we're trying to lead in such a way that we're sharing power and that we are not recreating harms to folks, that we are, our values are saying that we want to actually not create more harm in the world, but we unintentionally do so because we're not aware of some of the things that we're doing in the world. So that was the idea. And again, all those resources will be available to you on the Pathable platform. And I want to open up to any questions. I'll also scroll to see if there were some things, hopefully I did address, but if you want to kind of get back, if so, there was something that you also posted that is kind of way back in the thread, you can kind of repost that so it pops up and I can see that. Let's see. So I have this from Kim Fink. Hi Kim. Great tools. Do you have an example of how you would use a ladder in a meeting where you're making a decision? Oh, that's such a good question. Oh, I love it. Okay, so one way to do it is you can also see, all right, without getting too complicated, there can be ways in which you look at all those rungs of the ladder and you decide, if you say, you can make them kind of mini practices, okay? I experience and observe. Well, we've decided as a group, like, let's make a decision that we are not gonna make a decision until we are sure that we have, or do the best we can in terms of getting as much, getting the data necessary to make the strongest decisions that we can. You might have a process around data selection. You might have a process around, making meaning. So there could be like, so for instance, sometimes you have groupthink in a group. I've heard, this is a really interesting technique that I've heard a group do, which is they designate one person and it rotates, because it takes the burden off the one person who always is the one that has to be like, goes against the group. But there will be like, one person will be the person who gets the counter argument. Like, say something that introduces another way of thinking about this as a practice, right? To try to bring in another point of view, to try not to do that kind of right up the thing. So think about it in kind of all the ways in which you can look at all the aspects and be like, how is the way that we can make a decision that is a different way, that slows us down, that really questions, that kind of gives that kind of real fuller picture, maybe 360 picture. Maybe you decide, you know what are we doing? We don't even have enough data yet to be able to do this. Like, let's pause this for a second and go out there and ask some other questions of other people. So hopefully that answers a little bit about, like, think about the tools, not just as just one thing, like that ladder is just kind of one one thing, but literally policies and procedures in all sorts of different ways. Some folks like interviewing is one process that people go right up a ladder with biases, positive and negative. Sometimes you'd be like, that person reminds me of me. I like them, hire them, right? But the interview process perhaps is built in such a way that it takes these things into account. So you don't actually have like the ladder, you're not flying up the ladder inference. I hope that answered the question for you, Kim. And I know that we are, it's 2:31, but we have the room for a few more minutes. So if there's any other questions before you leave, I'm also happy to take that. Dana, thank you. It's scary when you think about how being someone empowered can impact the outcome of the ladder. Oh yeah, oh yeah, for sure. So even I think we're all here because we want to use our leadership platform and our power in the best way possible. I don't think it's, and once you start feeling like you have some of these tools in mind, and also kind of ways in which that you're getting feedback, it might feel a little less scary as a leader. But definitely the practice of using some of these tools will be super helpful to you, and you'll get more comfortable with the power that you have. Power is not bad. Power is not bad. I'd say I'm all for power, but like we just decide to use it in the ways that we know that are best furthers the lives and wishes and wants for our communities as we're building co-ops. Oh, that's interesting. Deborah, you are looking for the book list, but you don't see anything in the files tab. If it is not there, I'll make sure it gets there. So don't worry, it'll be a PDF, and it will have all the books that I mentioned, all the links to the article. There was an article, there's the video, all of that. So if it's not there, we'll get there for you. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you. Thank you for the feedback. And so I'm gonna be here for any remaining things. I know some people will probably be running, but I'm happy to take a few more things on. But I do, if you're leaving, or yeah, if you're about to leave, I just want to make sure that I extend my gratitude for the time that you're taking here to kind of learn together, to struggle together. It's all worth the work. And it really, for the people that you're organizing with, the people that are on your boards, the people who are in your community that are in the fight, working for Black liberation, you know, to lessen the violence out there in the world and all of that stuff. All of these tools are good, both in organizing co-ops in all sorts of different ways, but also in the broader world that we live, right? So we can hopefully live in a kinder place. So I can't thank you enough. Anything else? Thank you, much appreciated. Okay, I'm heading out. I can't thank you enough again. Be well, enjoy the rest of the sessions for the next few days. I might see you in some of the rooms, and you know how to reach out to me. Again, you should have the files, and I wish you all the best. Take good care.